Another week, another podcast, and I am joined by Kristen, Miss Filmingo, one half of the Kristen and Mac movie podcast. Kristen, thank you once again for joining me. We are here to talk about the next film from one of my favorite filmmakers working right now, the one and only Alex Garland, with his next directorial effort, Men. This is his first movie that he has directed since 2018's Annihilation, and it is his first directorial effort since the 2020 FX/Hulu miniseries Devs. This movie has a lot of crazy imagery. This movie has a lot of crazy stuff. So let's get right into it. Let's start breaking it down. Kristen, thank you once again for joining me. Do you have anything you want to say before we get this started?
Nothing, but I'm excited. So I'm ready to talk Men.
I'm excited. I just don't know if it's for the right reasons. All of that for on today's episode of the Talking TV podcast. All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Talking TV podcast. This is a little bit of a different episode today. We're finally actually getting to explore a film. You know, it's so interesting because the idea of, how this kind of evolved from the whole Scorsese conversation as far as the whole superheroes taking over and killing cinema, whatever. That discussion I'm quite frankly sick of, and I don't really want to have anymore because it's just annoying to me, frankly. And I think that ultimately the cinematic landscape will ultimately shift. And I think that, again, it's simply a matter of people just have to know where to look. And if people don't want to put the effort in to look for other avenues other than just whatever the massive studios are marketing to them, well, that's on them, is the only thing that I have to say. But we have the return of a couple different things here. We have the return of Alex Garland after 2 years. We have the next A24 movie, after, quite frankly, 1 year of essentially no A24 movies, in 1 year of, I think, some pretty lackluster A24 efforts. I feel like with the exception of Red Rocket and Come On, last year was kind of a dull year for A24. But this year, between Everything Everywhere All at Once and this movie, we are officially back. A24 is fully back and swinging. So, Kristen, before we actually get into this conversation, I wanted to talk to you about Alex Garland as a filmmaker. Because when I talked to you about wanting to do this movie, you gave a very interesting opinion about Garland, which I was actually kind of shocked at. I'm like, because for the most part, I feel like Garland is one of the new film brats as I've christened that. That for the most part everyone's loved. I've kind of assembled this panel of the new film brats, as I say, in terms of the new people who in this age of the internet and in the age of Marvel, I think are really coming in and trying to shift the storytelling and cinematic landscape in a way that I really haven't seen, I would say, since the 70s guys, that were coming out of film school. Such names that I include in that. I talked about this actually with Joe a couple weeks ago when we did our Northman podcast. Robert Eggers, Jordan Peele, Yorgos Lanthimos, Ari Aster, Barry Jenkins, Ryan Coogler, Taika Waititi, I would throw in there. Greta Gerwig, I would throw in there as well. And Alex Garland, I would say, is in a strange way kind of one of the kickoffs of those, because I feel like Ex Machina is kind of the precursor to a lot of these movies that ended up coming out. But so I wanted to get your take on Alex Garland as a filmmaker, what he means to you, if anything, and kind of what the effect you think his films have had so far on the shifting landscape.
Okay. Alex Garland, for me, I get it. He's a very ambitious filmmaker. I know the impact he's had recently on a lot of cinema experiences, but he's someone that I feel I just could never grab a hold of what he was trying to do or say. I think he's someone who tries to be a little bit more over the top, in my opinion, but he's someone I could never get in interest with his films. As someone who's seen Ex Machina, I've seen it a couple times, and every time I watch it, I still can't get myself to really liking it. I thought it was good. Don't get me wrong. Ex Machina is very good for what it does, but I just think that's fine. Annihilation, on the other hand, is a film I'm not even crazy about at all. I know it's a very split film, but him, I didn't see him in Devs. I haven't watched Devs, but he's someone who I will say is very ambitious and tries to push the envelope sometimes. I feel like more than other directors, and he has something that he wants to say clearly. However, with the newest film, which we'll talk about soon, but yeah, I hope that answers the question.
A little bit. I got from you what I needed. I definitely understand where you're coming from. Garland is a guy who, to me, has always been very interested in images and not so much in story, if that makes any sense. I think the reason why, for me, Ex Machina works so well is this idea that it is kind of this coming together almost of, in a strange way, kind of being ahead of its time as far as, our kind of conception of what artificial intelligence was and kind of
Yeah.
the way that we imbue these things with kind of our humanistic traits and almost how that kind of rebounds against us, just from a kind of a very, very surface level examination. And which I think that's probably the most interesting thing, considering that Garland is become such this force, at least in the indie filmmaking world of auteur filmmaking, when as a man who is so obsessed with images, when he got his start as a novelist. It's kind of crazy, because when you think about the amount of people who have actually shifted from complete manuscript writing to feature filmmaking, the list is a lot shorter than you would think. I think the only one that comes to mind recently is Michael Crichton, and even still, he only directed the one adaptation of his novel with the original 70s version of Westworld that now obviously has been adapted into the HBO series. But
Right.
so that to me is probably the most fascinating, because there's kind of been this low-key, I'll call it I don't really know what to call it, but there's kind of been this almost understanding of the fact that, it feels like authors are always going to have a better sense of story per se than filmmakers, which you wouldn't think, considering that, film is one part story, but film is also one part moving image. And that also obviously contributes to the idea of experimental filmmaking as well. The idea of, okay, do you necessarily need a quote unquote story, or at least our basic understanding of the word story? Usually we think of, probably the thing that we really base the majority of our stories off of is the Campbell's hero's journey. Do we really need that in order to kind of make the idea of the moving image interesting, right? Not necessarily from a blockbuster mainstream standpoint, but much more so from just a visceral, what is it that we are watching, and what is it about the image that fascinates us? Obviously it has evolved so much from the original concept, which is just the idea of simulated movement, the idea that what we're watching is not actually moving, even though in our brains we are viewing it as such. So I find that kind of really fascinating. And Garland is another one of those guys who I was doing a little bit of research on. I found that he has got probably one of the most interesting and fascinating trajectories, I think, of any of the filmmakers that I just listed off, where he got his start, obviously, as a novelist. He wrote the original novelization of The Beach that was then adapted by Danny Boyle into the 2000 film starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Famously, that film was heavily shifted from the novelization. That film barely resembles the original novelization on which it was based. But then, obviously, Garland, obviously most of the time you hear the story of, the author hates the adaptation of his work, obviously going back all the way to the Stephen King, Stanley Kubrick feud from The Shining back in the day. But fascinatingly enough, it almost felt like Garland was okay with this, because he then goes on and has at least a 5-year relationship with Danny Boyle, writing the screenplays for arguably two of Boyle's best films, 28 Days Later and Sunshine, before kind of transitioning into feature filmmaking himself. He was obviously very heavily involved in the making of the 2012 film Dread, starring Carl Urban, even to the point where even Carl Urban and the rest of the stars of that movie even attribute a majority of that movie's success much more so to Garland than the guy who's credited as the director, Pete Travis. Then obviously he also writes a script for Never Let Me Go before he gets started with feature filmmaking in Ex Machina. And the biggest thing that I've noticed, because I've seen everything that Garland has directed, including Devs, the miniseries that he did for Hulu right before the pandemic happened. And the thing for me that's always been so fascinating about him as a filmmaker is this idea that he almost has this implicit, it's a thing that I find a lot of my favorite filmmakers have in common, whether it's usually a lot of my favorite filmmakers, the best thing that I think that they're able to do, it's one of two things. It's they have either an implicit understanding of human nature and how we act, or they have an implicit understanding of our relationship to kind of cinema and the movie image and storytelling. Obviously, you look at all the greats, Tarantino, Spielberg, Scorsese, George Lucas. I feel like all of those guys, they kind of have that implicit understanding. And Garland, out of all the new guys that are up and coming, I think a lot of those guys are still trying to figure out what it is exactly that they're trying to understand about their films. They're constantly trying to figure out and still trying to experiment and figure out what it is that they like about their stuff. Obviously, especially now, since the advantage that a lot of these guys have that a lot of the guys before them didn't, is they have the medium of television, which now is expanded to almost become this entirely secondary means of feature storytelling,
Yeah, it's the new, pretty much anything that it goes, the new longer form of filmmaking at this point. You can just make an 8-hour film on like HBO and just have the same effect at this point.
Exactly. Exactly. Like, and like, just if you look at like what Taika Waititi's done, Taika Waititi has arguably been just as influential on TV as he has been in film. You know, obviously helping to greenlight, obviously, you know, the What We Do in the Shadows TV show, which is a direct spinoff of his film. Obviously, also him helping to greenlight, you know, Reservation Dogs for Hulu, and just right now the HBO Max show Our Flag Means Death. So you have a lot of these filmmakers that are kind of just branching out and really having a lot more to experiment with on a storytelling standpoint that previous filmmakers did not. Previous filmmakers, their idea was, okay, you put your movie out, it's got to be at least 2 hours or longer, and you're really only going to have this one shot in order to try and say what you're trying to say. Now that's not so much the case. And so what's fascinating to me about Garland is kind of how he's almost taken that trajectory and understanding and translated that into his work both across the TV and feature film landscape. Because obviously, after a movie like Annihilation came out, and I'm like, that's a movie where I'm like, I don't really necessarily care what kind of critical accolades it gets. This movie is just so fascinating and just so unlike anything that I've ever seen before that I just want to see what he does next. And so naturally, you can imagine my surprise when I find out that the next thing that he does is a miniseries. And I'm like, he's going to TV, to streaming?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can see that, like, even now, just like to branch off of, like, even now, Taylor Sheridan is like doing, you know, Mayor of Kingstown. He's like, his crown jewel at this point is Yellowstone.
Essentially running Paramount Plus with all of his different shows.
Yeah, I mean, and now they got 1932 coming out with Helen Mirren, and that's gonna be like awesome what he's been able to pull off. But you know, it's really shifting, and especially knowing now, I guess the pandemic hit, a lot of people are just adjusting to this norm of like, hey, more people are staying home and not going to the movies as much. So, you know.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. And the biggest thing for me and how that kind of reflects on Garland is this idea that Garland is really experimenting around and kind of using that in order to infuse his stories in this almost very non-traditionalist sense, but they also kind of still have some of those feature underlying like principles. Like, I think one of the most fascinating things about Ex Machina and why for me that film works so well is this fact that you have on the surface this kind of almost not traditionalist, but like this, you know, almost like what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like this Blade Runner-esque continuation of, okay, you know, these male figures, you know, one of whom has created this very advanced artificial intelligence that is supposed to be so closely resembling to a human being that one wouldn't be able to distinguish between the two of them. And then he pulls this trick where he then ends up almost using the male gaze as weapons against both the male characters in the film and against us as the audience members, to the point where then the artificial intelligence even ultimately is able to almost kind of use our own humanity against us, you know, which is kind of strange because I think it's the first time that I realized that I was seeing a filmmaker, let's call it, almost in favor of like the advancements in technology when so many other previous instances have been allegories trying to warn us against that. And that was really the first time that I'd seen somebody be like, no, this is not only gonna happen, but this is how it will happen almost, you know? And I feel like that's something that he's tried to pursue in every one of his films, in every one of his efforts since, you know, obviously Annihilation, you have this kind of traditionalist like alien invasion, like scientific exploration that ends up turning into this like allegory for like grief and dealing with personal loss. And then with Devs, you have, I also find it really interesting when I brought up Westworld before, where Devs was airing almost at the exact same time as Westworld season 3. And both of those shows were kind of dealing with this idea of, oh, you know, obviously free will versus preordained destiny, but also the fact that it's like, you know, what are the moral ramifications of somebody having this like machine that can literally predict time and space, and is it worth it at the cost of at the cost of finding like personal happiness again. So the thing that I love the most is that, and I guess kind of the consensus that I'm trying to come to about this bit, is this idea that Garland, while I will say it's very hit or miss for someone, I like that he is somebody who is still trying to go for these big, really massive, overhanging ideas, especially in an age where it feels like whenever somebody tries to go for that, it feels just like that they're more so criticized for it, you know?
Yeah.
Like 100%. So now that brings us to his latest film, Men. And in order to kind of sum up exactly what this film is about, this is a film that stars Jessie Buckley, who is one of my favorite up-and-coming actresses, as a woman who has just gotten over her husband committing suicide, kind of, sort of. They revealed, sort of more of the details of it. And in order to try and get away, she goes to this very fanciful, very isolated college in the country. They don't really, in the countryside in England, they don't really specify where it is, but she soon comes to find out that she is being, stalked by a series of men that all seem to have the same face. They're all portrayed by Rory Kinnear. And as the film goes on, the film then kind of transitions into this very, very visceral, very nightmarish, very surrealistic feeling, what's called, not exactly a horror trek, but this kind of like scenario where it's obviously asking a lot of big questions. And at the end of the day, it kind of leaves one feeling with this idea of, okay, is this trying to be just shocking and surrealistic for the sake of being surrealistic, or is this trying to say something different? So, Kristen, walk me through your thought process walking out of the theater, because I feel like it's one of the first times I feel this year where I walked out of the theater just being like, what did I just watch?
Okay, so that's a good question to set us up into. So I didn't really have any expectations. I just knew, I'm like, okay, when we talked about this, I was like, yeah, I'm in the mood to talk about some Alex Garland, since he's not a filmmaker I don't really love, but I thought this would be a great conversation. So I went in, normal, thinking like, okay, this is gonna be the standard, like hoping like some horror elements to it, because the last two films are very sci-fi, heavily influenced. This one is just pure straight horror, and which I liked. And walking out, I was like, what did I just watch? And it brought me back to the time of when Mother was released, of like, what the
Yes.
heck did I just watch? What the heck did I just give my $10 to get my mind swept in a completely different
What
direction?
theater are you going to where you have to only pay $10 to watch those movies? I need to find those theaters.
You got to get those AMC Stubs points.
I had to go to my Regal theater and pay that I almost never go to, and pay like $17 to go.
Oh, I didn't have to pay for that, honey. I didn't have to pay for that.
Lucky you. Lucky you.
Yeah, luckily enough, I got that good discount.
Oh,
but anyways,
those good AMC Stubs. It's good to see those things are still good for something.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. But anyways, I was just like transported into this one dimension, and I was just like, okay, well, that was a lot. And even walking out, I told you this before we were signing on, there was a lot of like, especially the last few minutes of the film is like, what the heck is going on? And I should say this, my theater was just practically sold out. So I got like one of the very last tickets to see it. And I walked in, and there were some people who did like leave during the movie. Actually, I should say that. But once the final credits hit, everybody was like asking everybody in the theater, what did I just watch? And one guy just asked me, do you understand what we just watched? And I was like, yeah.
I'm surprised they weren't just being like, tell us, please explain to us what it is.
And I just walked out because I was just traumatized at those last 10 minutes. I'm just like, I needed to shower. I felt like, knowing how much I witnessed, because I just felt like so uncomfortable, which I will give Alex Garland credit. I mean, like, it was very unexpected, which I like to see every once in a while. Because I should say this, I felt Ex Machina what felt too predictable, in my opinion, which is like shocking to many people. I feel like
very hot take there, but I like it. I dig it.
And this one, I was like totally thrown off the rails of especially what it wanted to do. But I will say that its messaging and what it wants to say is poorly executed.
Yeah. Most definitely. So we'll get into that a bit. I'll walk you through my experience. So I saw this with a friend of mine, the same guy who I also saw The Northman with. And he was also like, he's like, Dom, is like, I definitely know that whenever I see a movie with you, it's not going to be traditionalist in any sense. And I'm like, oh, just you wait. I'm like, I'm like, quick. I'm like, here, hold my beer. Cause like,
hold my beer.
I'm like, look, I've been pretty consistent with Garland over the last couple of years. You know, this is a dude who's kind of been with me since I graduated high school, because Ex Machina was about like early 2015. So that was like right when I graduated high school. So this is a dude who's been like pretty on my radar ever since. And like, it's one of those guys where I'm like, every time something comes out, it's like, okay, I have to see what he's got going on. So walking into this movie, I was like, okay, this is men. The message, it's literally in the title. The messaging is going to be kind of overt. This is what a majority of these movies just have to be about now, you know, but it's Garland and he's going to do something different. So I'll fight, you know, I'll see what this is about. Walked in. First hour, it's kind of whatever. I'm like, this is just, like, it's a typical horror setup. I don't really know where this is going. I'm kind of getting a little bit bored. I'm like, I'm never on my phone whenever I'm in the theater. Never, ever, ever. But I was almost tempted to be like, okay, like,
its pacing is not great.
Pacing is not the best. And then the twist comes once the men, let's call them, all played by Rory Kinnear, start revealing themselves. And from that moment all the way to the end of the movie, me and my friend are just sitting there. I swear to God, I have not had a moment in a theater with someone like this since Chris and I saw The Invisible Man in theaters way back in 2020, right before the pandemic happened, where we were just sitting there gobsmacked, just looking at each other back and forth, our mouths down, our jaws down to our seat, just being like, what in the hell is going on? And like, the imagery is so visceral and it's so disgusting, but it's so openly raw. And I'm just like, in the back of my mind, I'm like, this is either the best thing I've ever seen or the worst thing I've ever seen. This is just all over the place. But
it's very interesting because I watched a lot of people before we signed on for like practically for the last 2 hours. I was watching various different people's opinions, and it's been interesting to see how split everyone has been, which I will give also credit to him to make it so more of a conversational piece, which I think is great. And I think he likes to do.
100%. I like that. I like when filmmakers are able to do that, especially since it seems like so few filmmakers are able to do that now. It feels like almost like after the polarizing nature of the last couple of movies that came out over the last couple of years, it just feels like so many movies are just so adamant about trying to just have like that one overall consensus, right? And that's kind of the place where we are in the culture, where everything is just so divisive. It just has to be on one side or the other. There's really kind of no room anymore for these like intellectual think pieces or things that can even stimulate these intellectual think pieces. And that's why I just love that Garland is still able to do this. Here's kind of where I come down to it. Not necessarily come down to it, but kind of where let's say like my thoughts start to begin to dissect this movie. I like that you bring up Mother, because I have similar things with Mother in that I think that this is the first instance where his obsession with the image has kind of trumped really anything else. And while I haven't really had a problem with that with his past efforts, because with his past efforts, for the most part, he's always able to kind of have some sort of let's call it not necessarily deeper message. I hate you, like deeper themes. I hate using like anything, but like his images have always been, I think, great exemplifications of the themes that he is trying to go for. You know, obviously, again, he is very, very interested in the exploring the female perspective, specifically from the male viewpoint. I feel like this is something that's been very, very apparent in all of his feature films that he's done, and it's very, very apparent here, specifically in that last bit. You know, I think that's kind of the most obvious thing. Obviously, again, the ideas of sci-fi, you know, the ideas of artificial intelligence, you know, kind of how that dictates our decision making and all of that, of, you know, typical sci-fi principles and all that. But again, like this feeling of loss, this feeling of these outsiders who can't really relate to everybody, all of that, you know, people who have largely almost every single one of his main characters, I think with the exception of Ex Machina, they've almost all suffered from some sort of tragedy of some kind. You know, that's, I think, a big motivating factor in Devs as well. And I think that's kind of what makes Devs work for me so well. But my biggest thing that I'm still trying to speculate and trying to figure out here is this ultimately going to mean anything other than, like, it's crazy because for as visceral and as crazy as this movie got, this might be the first time that I've ever said that an Alex Garland movie is surface level. And I never ever want to say that about anything Alex Garland related, but it's literally in the title. It's quite literally in the title. And while I do think that this accomplishes better than what Mother was trying to do, I guess just because my problem with Mother is that Mother was too on the nose about
very much.
Mother may as well have been an adaptation to me. You know, this at the very least felt like something original. And this felt like a new take on an old story, as opposed to Mother, which was just like trying to be so. I think the thing that makes Mother come off as way more pretentious than this is Mother is something that is trying to be super smart and trying to trick its audience and trying to manipulate and fool its audience and push them into a bunch of different directions, when it's like, dude, we know what you're trying to do here. Like, it's so obvious. This one, I think it was a little bit less obvious, but I don't know. What's really your take on that?
Yeah, you perfectly said that to what I wanted was. I think Mother, I did not like Mother. This one I could understand more, and especially what it wants to say with its religious themes. So I could say from going off of that, how do I now go off of that?
It's a lot, yeah.
But oh gosh.
Okay. Just as far as in like the whole, what's it called? The whole, like you said, the whole Adam and Eve, the whole Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
The problems with Mother is just that it's like, it's become so obvious after a certain point. Like, I don't know what point you realize what it was, but I'm like, okay, the opening scene, I'm like, okay, you know, this and that. Okay. He's an author, he's a poet, whatever. And then they bring in, you know, the two outsiders. Like, oh, you helped me so much. I'm like, is this supposed to be is he supposed to be God? I'm like, you know, like, obviously it's in this isolated house in the countryside. It's supposed to be this whole, it's obviously in this isolated house in the countryside. They're kind of away from civilization. You don't really know where they are. It starts off obviously with this burning imagery, and then you have, once they bring in the brothers and the one brother kills the other, I'm like, Cain and Abel.
And then they start with the baby and the whole birth of the baby scene.
I'm like,
you know, that was, I was so checked out. I think once, I guess I could spoil it because it's from 2017 at this point.
Yeah, it's 5 years old now. So
Kristen Wiig steps in. I just was like, all right, I'm done.
Yeah.
Who knows where this could go out the deep end at this point. And
I mean, just at that point, like, that was just the point where I'm like, Kristen Wiig.
I was like, is this a comedy? No.
Well, also just like Kristen Wiig showing up in anything. I'm just like, I'm just completely checked out. I'm like, Kristen Wiig showed up. I'm like, no, I'm out. Just
it doesn't make sense what I wanted to do. But anyways, for this film, it's a little different. Kristen Wiig does not show up in Men.
Thank God. Thank God. That would have. I feel like that would have been so. Well, it's funny too, because did you catch the cameo of the chick who was playing the sister? Because like, literally the only, because there's only 4 characters in this entire movie. I feel like it's obviously Jessie Buckley, all the men that are in that place, all played by Rory Kinnear, who I think is absolutely amazing with his different performances.
He did an excellent job with this film, and I really dug every single performance he did. I was really captivated by all the different people he was playing. I thought it was always a different actor, so I give a lot of credit to the
most definitely.
You know, them with the manipulation of like the CGI, you know, special effects stuff, cool. And then also the makeup team, because they did a really, really good job with that.
Yeah, 100. That was probably the most compelling part, is just the Rory Kinnear performance and like just everything that they were really trying to go for. Because because it was one of the things that I was trying to pay attention to, and I'm like, okay, I'm seeing all the setup. I'm like, they all kind of look like the makeup, but I wasn't really sure until like the shift happens, and I'm like, oh no, these are
it's like that reincarnation thing of the same person. That's what I was able to get out of that. But no, the casting for this was really great, and I also need to give props to Jessie Buckley. I think this is probably my favorite performance she's done, hands down.
I don't know if this one is my favorite. I really, really like the work that she's doing in this movie. The thing that I've always liked about Buckley is able to bring almost, even in movies that I don't like, that I know she's in, like, I'm not a fan of, I'm thinking of ending things at all.
Oh, I love that movie too.
I'm not a fan of that one. I'll get to that one in a bit. But
The Lost Daughter, did not like that.
The Lost Daughter, not a fan of that. I think she's good in that, though. Is the thing, probably my favorite performance of her so far has been her performance in Fargo season 4, just because of how funny she was.
Yeah.
Just because of how funny she was in that. But my biggest thing about Buckley is one of those actresses who, no matter what you see her in, it always feels like there's something like a little extra that you don't know about her. She's always got this air of mysteriousness about her. And if anything, I feel like that's kind of what made the first couple minutes of this movie so interesting, because you obviously, you know, you're being told about this, like, kind of, you know, this super tragic event that happened with her husband, who in the film was played by Papa Essiedu. But it almost feels like for the first couple of minutes, like while Rory Kinnear is showing her around the house, it feels like there's something that is not being known, you know? And the problem, I think, comes from when the curtain is pulled back as far as kind of her, not necessarily the part that she played, let's call it, in the relationship overall. And so that I think is kind of what ultimately, let's call it, tanks it at the end. But I'm always a fan of like kind of the mysterious edge that she is able to bring. I have particularly thought that she was really good in also in very, very tiny part, but in her bit part that she had in the Chernobyl miniseries, I thought that was really interesting, kind of, you know, the humanity that she brought as far as kind of, you know, being the civilian on the ground within that tragedy happening. But Yeah, I think she brings that mysterious edge. I think she's able to. The difficult thing that she has to do is, specifically in the third act, is she has to handle just the absolutely disgusting thing that is unfolding in front of her, while also like being inquisitive about it at the same time. And just given
Yeah.
what we witnessed at the end of this movie, that is a tough act to pull off. That is a
Did you
really
notice
tough
she has
act
the
to pull
same
off.
expression?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Which is so unique. I would just be like,
And it's crazy because I feel like from a lesser actress, I would have hated that, and it would have destroyed the performance completely.
yeah. And I thought that was really unique how she just stayed the same face the entire time. I just was like, damn.
Yeah. It was mind blowing completely. So, I feel like we've tinkered around it a bit. We've kind of like hunkered around. You know, we didn't really spoil it, which I give props to both of us for that, for not being
Yeah,
spoiling it.
honestly.
So I feel like we gotta kind of break down that third act, because that's ultimately the make or break
That-
of the movie, because it's both simultaneously the most fascinating part about the movie. It's it's so visceral that like literally it is gonna have everyone talking about it everybody that watched this movie is gonna have them talking about it and thinking about it for years on end. I saw this movie on Thursday last week, and I've not stopped
It's
thinking about it
like
since.
it will definitely be, I feel like, the film where it's going to be shown in all the film classes to be like, all right, let's dissect this ending right now.
Yep. And it's
But
also, in a strange way, I think the break of the movie, you know, because
Mhm.
it's so visceral, but like you said, it's very on the nose with its themes ultimately. And what it ultimately says at the end, I'm like, was this worth what we just witnessed? And like, this is kind of what I
Yeah.
mean when it's the
And
most
that's
surface
where a
level.
lot of people came in to criticize that, and which I completely agree with, was did it do its justice? And no, it doesn't. I really felt
Kind
that.
of
I
doesn't.
guess maybe the previous stuff that was happening in the film did it. And I have to tell you this. Um, the ending, now I feel like I can spoil can I spoil it
Yeah,
now?
we can spoil it. Go right ahead.
Okay, good. Okay, so when I thought this movie was gonna end was when she hit the housekeeper
Okay.
and she hit him. And I was like,
Right. Hit him with the
okay,
car. Right.
with the car, and because she's trying to get out.
Right.
And I was like, okay, it's gonna pull a get out type thing, you
Right.
know.
That's fully what I was expecting to. I'm like, okay, movie's over here. This is where she
Yeah,
gets away.
and she
Cool.
was gonna go back to her life, be with her sister, maybe, stay away from toxic men and the toxic masculinity, which it was trying to emulate here. But, no, it just goes on for another 10 minutes where we experience the most craziest ending I have ever seen this year.
Oh man,
Let
I
me
was
tell
about to
you
say, I'm
that
like,
ending.
do you want to try and tackle and describe this ending for the viewers, or me?
Why don't you do it?
All
Because
right.
I just feel like
So essentially, what happens is throughout the second half, Jessie Buckley starts discovering that again, she runs into a series of different men across the town. Obviously, the housekeeper. She's being stalked by this weird man who looks like he's like infected with plants, who doesn't speak.
the
She
little
runs into
boy.
this little kid outside of a church, the vicar of the church. And she starts to notice that all of these guys, again, they look very similar because again, they are all played by Rory Kinnear. And
Mhm,
so naturally, of course, you have the whole, okay, they all start, trying to attack her, whatever. There's crazy
mhm.
stuff. She tries to get away, all that. She hits the one dude. And then she starts noticing that the men start replacing each other. Like, obviously, the famous horror cutaway. I've even done this with some short films that I've done. It's an old trick where it cuts away and then it cuts back to it, and all of a sudden it's a different person, but obviously with the
Yeah.
same face and a different form. And what we witness at the end is the men start literally reproducing,
And
where you
giving birth
and
to
literally giving birth, and
another.
you have these super close-ups of, again, if you've seen the birthing video in health class, you know
Yeah.
exactly what it is that I'm talking
But
about.
I will admit there's one part of the birthing part where it does not come out of the normal part. It either comes out of
Whatever you call it, again, it's
the
like
stomach and then it comes out of the mouth, and I'm
it's
like,
like it's literally like I'm trying to think of like how to. It's not exactly like it's almost like you're witnessing like mitosis in real life, but like as a human being, where they're literally like just like kind of devolving from each other. Like it's so difficult to describe. Like I said,
yeah.
it's so visceral of an image. I'm like, I don't even want to know what Alice Garland thinks about it on a daily basis for him to come up with something that crazy and that visceral and that just nutso. Like
I wonder if that's his nightmares and he just writes them down in like a dream journal, and it's like, this is the idea for the movie.
I mean, props to him, because that's like one of the best ways to come up with ideas for. But yeah, and then it ultimately results in all of the men ending up as this series of reproductions, let's call it, happens, they end up like devolving into, I guess, the ghost of her husband, who then kind of has this conversation about her. And kind of what's revealed about the relationship is the fact that she just felt like she was kind of essentially just getting sick of him because he was being too emotional. And so as a result, that led to him hitting her. And then when she forced him out, he killed himself. And that's kind of the part where I'm like,
the thing was, I don't know if he was also the director. Alex Garland was also trying to say he was abusive, because we only get one instance where
true. You're right.
she was abused, and that was like, when she got, hit in the face, and I think we needed to experience more of that ending and more of their relationship, because sorry to go off different segment for this point. The one thing I did not like about this movie is that, like, it shows the same footage over and over and over again, and never something new to explore more about the relationship that they had as a couple.
I agree. And I don't know. I don't want to attribute that to COVID filmmaking, because this kind of became pretty obvious that this was shot under some sort of COVID lockdown procedures. The fact that there's only 2 people in the movie, the fact that it's a very isolated setting, the fact that there's not a whole lot of different set and scenario changes, the fact that it's loaded set, like the signs are pretty much there that this was kind of obviously a COVID shoot. And I think you're right. That's the biggest thing that's missing from me, is the fact that we have so little context for their initial relationship. Now, what I will say is the idea that he's going for is very interesting. The idea of exploring, a shift up of the typical like gender relationship, because obviously the ideas of gender norms, like obviously this has been a thing in movies since time immemorial, the idea of like, obviously more emotionally restrictive men having to deal with more emotionally outbursive women. And the fact that he does it as a shift, and that like kind of leading to like a divulge in the relationship, and the fact that he tries to shift that this time and have it more so seem like, okay, so the woman in the relationship is much more so emotionally closed off, and as a result is not able to tolerate her male partner's more emotional outbursts, and as a result that's what leads to like kind of a fracturing of their relationship. I thought that initial idea was actually kind of fascinating, but he doesn't really go into it, and
no, it doesn't,
and instead tries to use this visceral crazy imagery as like a demonstration of that. And does it all work? I don't really think so, but also at the same time it's one of those things where it's like, does it need to, in a strange way, And that's kind of where I'm at a loss for words. And that's kind of what I'm still trying to figure out ultimately. And which, I mean, I guess if the movie still got me thinking that much about it, I guess that's a good thing, but I guess that really depends on who you talk to just about it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the most interesting thing is, the thing is I'm trying to get most out of this point is how the tunnel affects the film. That's the only thing. Because, where she does those echoes. That's the one thing I haven't been able to.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing too, because that also goes into the sound design of the film as well. Because I don't know if you notice it, but like kind of the sound designs that they use for the rest of the film is a combination
repeated.
And so it's a repeated thing of the echoes that she does in the tunnel as well. I think they also use like Rory Kinnear's voice and like the sounds that he makes, like like the screaming that he does at the end. Like it's a mix between the two of them, and it creates for something again like just this entire tone and vibe that is just so incredibly unlike anything that I've really ever seen before. And it just completely shocks me to my core, just gets you to pay attention. And so this is where I'm actually going to pivot and transition the discussion into the A24 side of things, because I think that also matters here as well too, where the thing that I've been very interested about, specifically in the A24 films that I've really gravitated towards, is almost their not so ignoring, but their very much adherence to this strict set of very much wanting to break down the core concept of the 8-sequence structure that we always kind of typically attribute to screenwriting and storytelling. We both went to film school. We both completely understand, the 8-sequence structure and how that goes into storytelling and everything. And so it's been so fascinating these last couple of years, that A24 has been pretty prominent in order to see how A24 has been both championing those principles of cinema that it feels like just haven't been there in blockbuster filmmaking for the last 10 years, while also completely ignoring them and kind of, doing their own thing, which is, of course, is also a part of, the filmmaking process, the idea of needing to experiment in order to continue the format and the medium. And Garland is a big contributor to that, because Garland is kind of the guy that got them started, because Ex Machina is really, they'd had a couple of successes in low-key successes in 2013 with Spring Breakers and The Spectacular Now and The Bling Ring. I remember getting a decent amount of attention
Mhm.
back then. And then 2014 is kind of almost the forgotten year of A24. But then
Which is also a great year
it's a
too.
great year for A24. I love a majority of the movies, but like you look back at the movies, it's like who still talks about a most violent year? Who still talks
Yeah.
about what's called Under
Lock,
the Skin, Lock, Enemy. Again, we get Denny Villeneuve's
Enemy.
Enemy that year as well. So we get all of these movies. But 2015 is really the year that puts them on the map between this movie winning because this is also the year where A24 wins 2 Oscars because this Ex Machina wins
Mhm.
visuals, and then Brie Larson famously wins her Oscar for Room
The
as well.
Room. Yeah.
So that's kind of and then 1 year later they win Best Picture for Moonlight. So
Yeah.
my biggest thing for A24 is kind of, again, all my favorite movies, the Florida Project, and the rise of certain filmmakers that have given to the Florida Project with Sean Baker. No, great. Now I would have to probably look it up, but obviously, them kind of giving rise to Robert Eggers, Ari Aster, a lot of these other film brands that I've kind of talked about, and how it I feel like a big example of this too is Uncut Gems, where with everything that the Safdie brothers did, the thing that was so fascinating about that movie is how the Safdie brothers were able to take this traditionalist idea of, okay, whenever somebody is watching a film, they need breaks within tension, because the original idea was that if the tension just keeps going and going and going, people lose interest. And the fact that the Safdies are able to kind of almost create this fever dream nightmares pit that just never ever stops until the final shot of the film, where it feels like at the end of that 2 hours and 15 minutes of Uncut Gems, you feel like you're breathing for the first time after that entire ride. It's been so fascinating, especially in an age where, again, in the age of Marvel, in the age of the internet, where I feel like nobody wants to watch original ideas, nobody, quote unquote, wants to watch new movies. I don't think that's the case at all, and I really haven't bought into that, as I've said at the beginning of this conversation. I'm more so very much in the mindset of, no, it's just the fact that nobody is really doing the work in order to try and figure out what it is that people
Or at
want
least
to watch.
try to find them. It's very hard to say to get people, I feel like, to watch a film like this. But I mean, like, hey, then again, my theater was almost sold out. But like, people will seek out like creative ideas. But it's all about this at this point in day and age. It's about the marketing.
Well, and that's a great point, too, because you're right. It's not even necessarily an idea of what people want to watch, because that's always been the thing of the longest time, of where it's like people don't know their own viewing habits. And it always feels like whenever something like kind of blows up and people really gravitate towards it, it almost feels like an accident. Kind of
Mhm.
that's always been like part of like my fascination of exploring like the things that have been like the most successful throughout the history of movies in Hollywood, is almost every time, with the exception of if it's based off prior existing source material that people already had some sort of an attachment to. And even then it sometimes blows up in their face, because this goes all the way back to, because this idea of kind of, people's rejection of things that are based off IP, that goes all the way back to 1939, when Clark Gable's being interviewed about Gone with the Wind. And in one of the interviews, they ask him about, whether he read the book and anything. And he's like, let me just say that, that I ran into a person who had read the book, and they made their thoughts on their idea of Red Butler very, very clear, and that it was not at all necessarily the same as my portrayal. So I think the
Mhm.
idea that A24 is more not necessarily interested in stories, but more so interested in what it is that fascinates us about the moving image, where they create these very visceral and always fascinating images. Like, you take like one shot from any A24 movie, you could pick out like 15 different things about it that already like differentiate it.
Yeah.
That, I think, is kind of what's been so fascinating, them tracking them since I really started like really consistently paying attention to them probably in 2016. But that's been like part of the thing that's been so fascinating about them. I don't know what, like, what's your thought process on that?
With the A24
Yeah, with the
and
A24 of it all.
okay, so my attention, like, I was starting to get into like was I should say like 2014 was when I graduated, and I started to get to know this fascination and this unique idea of A24 creating the experience of, I think they like to do is put the shocking element and create take on films that nobody has ever thought of the concept of, and just run wild with it, and they let their filmmakers say whatever they want, what they want to do, because they know it'll either grab the attention or it'll just start a conversation, which is what I think they want people to do most of.
For sure. Yeah, they definitely want people discussing about talking about their movies, and how they've been able to kind of capture that through image more so than story and character per se, I think is really fascinating, because like I
Yeah.
don't think I've heard a single person who I talk to about A24 movies talk about any of the characters or the stories per se, which is really interesting because in the past, I feel like that's always been the case with movies. They're almost always talking about like their favorite characters or, or the story or anything. But when it comes to an A24 movie, you really don't have that. Instead, you're more so just trying to talk about just like what it is that you watched and trying to figure out like just how the film made you feel overall with its presentation of images, using almost like its actors and it's more so as tools in order to elicit emotion, much more so than I feel like any other previous instance. And with the exception of, I think, last year, obviously, the last couple of years were obviously the COVID years of, obviously there was only so much that they were going to be able to do. Again, like the two movies, like I watched Minari and On the Rocks in 2020. Those are both like fine, cutesy movies. And then a lot of the films last year, I just felt like weren't working for me, with the exception of Sean Baker's Red Rocket.
Yeah.
And, that was a big one. That film, too, even though, like, that was not necessarily traditional, that was like this really interesting exploration of narcissism that was trying to ask these bigger, deeper questions and like putting its characters in positions where it's like, are these good people or are
these bad people?
So are these bad people or are these just people who are trying to get by? And like the fact that it never really takes a consistent hard stance on it. The interesting thing about that movie too is just how it was able to, in a strange way, pull what Birdman did with Michael Keaton and almost have that film be like this retrospective on Simon Rex's entire career and just show him in a completely new light that we really weren't familiar with before. And as far as how that applies to this movie, Men, the biggest thing that I can say is it is probably the biggest demonstration of them playing around with imagery that I think I've seen yet. And in a strange way, this also kind of reminds me a lot of what The Green Knight was trying to do last year, which was another film that didn't necessarily... you were a fan of that?
I loved Green Knight, and I loved Red Rocket just as much. And however, I will give... This is what I'm going to say about Green Knight. I love Green Knight, and I love what they did with the Green Knight itself, because it just reminded me of that film, of what they were doing with this naked man with the leaves, and like I liked that interpretation of the character better than they did it with here. I thought that like felt too on like the nose. I don't know if Alex Garland saw that. It was like, oh, I would love to do that concept too of this.
It's very interesting how A24 is starting to get into a little bit of HBO territory where it's like,
well, they have that thing with Euphoria, so
yeah, so it's like you're definitely pulling a little bit from each other, just a little bit. Like it's all for the same
them all
company.
Be in like the cinematic universe. Like,
don't even get me started. Listen, look, this is the effects that Marvel's had of the public conscious. I literally saw a meme the other day that was so tragic and heartbreaking, but so unbelievably true. Where they're like, how you get people to start watching every movie? Just tell them that every movie is going to cross over with every other movie. Make sure that they're all post-credit scene and just put the Marvel logo in front of everything. Yeah. Everyone will watch every movie, and I'm like, that is so beyond stupid, but so brilliant. Like, because it would 100% work. It would 100% work. And I guess the reason why it's so fascinating, obviously, again, it's kind of the point where we can literally not even do any sort of a podcast. We can't even do a podcast about an A24 movie without bringing up Marvel. But it is so fascinating to continue to explore the effects that it has had on the cinematic landscape. But what I find so interesting is now, after year one of Marvel back from the pandemic, and for the most part, a lot of their stuff not getting a whole lot of the critical reception that previous efforts did, and that seems to have continued for the most part into this year after Moon Knight and Doctor Strange. Obviously, we have Miss Marvel and Thor: Love and Thunder and She-Hulk coming out soon. But the biggest thing for me is kind of how, now that Marvel is not necessarily critically beloved, and slowly over time, I think will start to not become as much the center of culture. I think now is the ripe opportunity for movies, not necessarily like this, but much more so interesting movies, to start to get a little bit more of attention on them, which I think is awesome, because obviously that's what I've been wanting for the last couple of years, and it just sucked because it seemed like for the longest time these movies were trying to fight for attention, and we're trying to fight for attention, and then obviously the pandemic sets in, and then there's just no movie. So we're still obviously in this re-emergence period from the pandemic. And so I think my biggest source of joy, let's call it, from this year in general, specifically, much more so than last year, because last year, again, we were just getting bombarded with all the movies that we were originally gonna get in 2020.
Right.
Which is part of, just don't even get me started. The less said about 2021, the better. But the thing that's been so interesting for me about 2022 is how all of the movies that I've seen, not one of them has been the same as the other one, whether it worked or not. And that's a big thing to say, especially given in a time when it feels like so many movies are so similar, or feeling so similar, rather.
Right, and I think that's the greatest part about this how this whole year has been. It's been very unexpected with a lot of the films that we've seen, especially from A24, because I think my favorite A24 film I've seen so far this year has been X.
Oh, X, really? Not Everything Ever All at Once. Interesting. Because
This is a shame on me. I haven't seen
Okay,
everything all
okay,
at
okay,
once
okay. I
yet,
was
so
about to say, I'm like,
I do want
because
to see
everyone
it.
who's seen that movie, like, I don't think it's crazy. I don't think I've seen a single person who's seen that movie who hasn't liked it. It's nuts. Like, even guys who I'm like, there's no way they would like this movie, and they watch it, they fucking loved it. I'm like, let's go. Like, because I was so anticipating that movie just based on the talent behind it, like that the Russos, almost like kind of the Russos company Agbo, like teamed up with
Mhm.
A24 to fund this movie from the Daniels, who'd already directed another one of my previous favorite A24 movies, Swiss Army Man. And then I find out what the movie's going to be, and I'm like, it's a multiverse movie. I'm like, there's no way this movie is not going to be good. And then it's one of those things. It's so rare when you get a movie that's just as good as you thought,
Right.
and then better, and then it just surpasses your expectations, just like every way. And what I will say is that I can definitely say that for both Everything Everywhere All at Once and X. I don't necessarily know if I could say that for this movie. And
Mhm.
what I can say in my final kind of consensus on it is, while this is a film that will definitely be one of the most visceral and crazy experiences, like, I definitely, like, if you just want something that will leave you completely blown away and questioning what it is that you watched, I heavily, heavily recommend this movie.
Right, I
But
can also say the same thing. I think it's not for like what A24 films are most of the time, not for the average audience member.
no, not at all.
No, and I think if it's someone who is like, because well, I think the theater that I went to with is just pure horror fans in general, and most of the horror fans what I walked out with, like I said earlier, they didn't like it, and I just feel like this is a film I can't fully recommend because of what it wants to do and what it wants to say. It is daring. So if you want to go into something that's more daring and more kind of not so on the nose what it wants to say or figure out what it wants to be, then go in, figure out your own explanation and see it. But
Yeah, one
just
hundred
like,
percent. Yeah, 100%. My biggest thing, and this is probably like the first instance where I'm not going to give a star rating on a movie, because honestly, I wouldn't even know where to begin as far as giving this star rating, mostly just because I'm still just trying to figure out like my thoughts on the movie itself. This is going to be one of those movies that definitely bounces around on my list for the rest of the year, up until the end of the year, potentially for all time. All I'll say is this is one of those movies where you have got to know what you are getting yourself into, because or don't, or just go in and be pleasantly surprised. You could do that as well. This is the first
yeah.
movie in a while that I could definitely say is very, very, it is surprising. Well, that's a pleasant surprise. That's up to each individual person. But yeah, that's it. That is our conversation on Alex Garland's Men. Kristen, this was awesome. Thank you so much. This is a great conversation. These are the types of conversations that I was hoping to have, that Chris and I were starting to have at the beginning when we first started this podcast, and then the pandemic kind of ripped that away from us. But I'm glad that we can still have these interesting conversations. I'm definitely going to have
Right.
you back on the podcast later on at some point this year. Where can the good people follow you on the interwebs?
Oh, the good people. So thank you all for watching. The good people can find me at Miss Filmingo on Instagram, on Twitter at KFilmingo, and you can see me all over the web. I do all other podcasts. I write for other websites. So you can also catch me on the MNK Productions podcast, which Dom and Chris need to come on. They
Yeah, we
haven't
do.
come on yet.
Yeah, we
You,
do.
you guys need to come on eventually.
Don't
So
worry, it'll happen
please.
at some point.
Okay, good, because we have a great podcast there. So yeah, just tune into that, and thank you for having me. And I hope I'll be back soon. So
Most definitely. Most definitely. Don't worry. I've already got the summer schedule planned out, so you will definitely be back at some point. Of course, I am Dom the Movie Nerd. Follow myself at Movie Nerd Reviews across all platforms. Be sure to follow the podcast at Official Talking TV Podcast across all platforms. Subscribe to us if you were seeing us on YouTube.
oh
Oh
my god.
man, the dog. He heard it. What's it called? And then of course be sure to follow us on Twitch as well if you are watching this live stream this morning. And as always, people, 12 seasons in a short film and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.